What happens when one of Hollywood's most unpredictable actors sits down for what should be a routine morning show appearance, but instead becomes one of the most uncomfortable moments in live television history? Before we get into this wild story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about celebrities walking off interviews. Now let's dive into what really went down between Bob Thornton and Gayle King on CBS This Morning. The cameras are rolling, the studio lights are bright, and Bob Thornton settles into the guest chair across from Gayle King. The audience at home has no idea they're about to witness something completely unprecedented. Gayle opens with her signature warm smile, the kind that's disarmed thousands of guests over the years. Gayle starts things off in her typical fashion, welcoming Bob to the show and mentioning his latest project. She's done her homework, as always, referencing his recent film and the critical acclaim it's been receiving. Bob nods, gives a slight smile, but there's something in his energy that feels off from the start. Anyone who's watched enough of his interviews knows he can be moody, unpredictable. But this feels different. Gayle moves into her first real question, asking Bob about his creative process and what drew him to this particular role. It's standard interview territory, the kind of question he's answered 100 times before. But instead of giving the usual actor's response about finding the character or connecting with the script, Bob pauses for what feels like an eternity. The silence hangs in the air, awkward and heavy. Gayle's smile doesn't falter, but you can see a flicker of concern in her eyes. Finally, Bob speaks, but his tone is flat, almost dismissive. He tells Gayle that he doesn't really like talking about his process, that it's personal and not something he feels comfortable dissecting on television. Gayle, being the professional she is, pivots smoothly. She acknowledges his feelings and shifts to asking about working with his co-stars instead, surely a safer topic. But Bob isn't making this easy. He gives short, clipped answers. Yes, they were great. No, nothing particularly memorable happened on set. His responses are barely more than a few words each, forcing Gayle to work overtime to keep the conversation flowing. You can see her doing mental calculations, trying to figure out how to salvage this interview and fill the segment time. Gayle decides to try a different approach. She brings up Bob's music career, something he's usually more animated about discussing. She mentions his band, his love for drumming, and asks him about balancing his passion for music with his acting work. For a brief moment, it seems like she's found the key. Bob's posture shifts slightly, and there's a hint of interest in his expression. He starts to talk about music, about how it's always been his first love, how acting came later, and almost by accident. Gayle leans in, encouraging him, asking follow-up questions about his influences and his songwriting. The conversation is finally starting to flow, and you can almost see the relief wash over the production team watching from behind the cameras. But then Gayle makes a comment that changes everything. She mentions how successful he's been as an actor, how he's won awards and critical praise, and suggests that maybe music is more of a hobby compared to his acting career. It's not meant as an insult, just an observation based on his mainstream recognition. But the moment those words leave her mouth, Bob's entire demeanor shifts. His jaw tightens, his eyes narrow. The temperature in the studio seems to drop 10 degrees. Gayle realizes immediately that she's stepped on a landmine, but it's too late to take it back. Bob leans forward in his chair, his voice low and controlled, but there's an edge to it that wasn't there before. He tells Gayle, very clearly, that music is not a hobby. It's not something he does on the side for fun. He's a musician who happens to act, not the other way around. The passion in his voice is unmistakable, but so is the anger. Gayle tries to clarify, explaining that she didn't mean to diminish his music, that she was simply speaking to how the public perceives his career. Bob cuts her off mid-sentence. He tells her that he doesn't care how the public perceives anything, that their perception doesn't define his reality or his priorities. Gayle attempts to steer back to safer ground, suggesting they talk about his upcoming tour dates. But Bob isn't interested in moving on. He wants to make his point, and he's going to make it whether Gayle likes it or not. He starts talking about how the entertainment industry constantly tries to box people in, how once you're known for one thing, everyone expects you to stay in that lane. His voice is rising now, not quite shouting but definitely louder than appropriate for morning television. Gayle tries to interject, to acknowledge his frustration, while also attempting to bring the energy back down. But Bob is on a roll. He brings up other actors who are also musicians, rattling off names and asking Gayle rhetorically if she would call their music a hobby. Would she tell them that their true calling is acting? Gayle shakes her head, trying to explain again that's not what she meant. But Bob is past the point of listening. He's making a statement now, using this platform to air a grievance that clearly runs deep. Gayle, ever the professional, attempts a different tactic. She apologizes if her words came across wrong, acknowledging that music is clearly important to him and that she respects his artistry in all its forms. It's a gracious attempt at de-escalation, the kind of move that usually works to smooth over awkward moments. But Bob isn't accepting the olive branch. He tells her that it's not about her specific words, it's about the attitude they represent. The assumption that acting is more legitimate than music, that commercial success in one area makes everything else secondary. Gayle's co-hosts are watching this unfold with barely concealed shock, unsure whether to jump in or let Gayle handle it. The producers are definitely screaming into someone's earpiece right now, trying to figure out how to get this interview back on track. Gayle makes another attempt, asking Billy Bob what he wants people to know about his music, giving him the floor to say his piece. But instead of taking the opportunity to promote his band or discuss his artistic vision, Billy Bob turns the question around. He asks Gayle why she thinks people need to know anything. Why can't the music just exist on its own terms, without constant explanation or justification? It's a philosophical point, and maybe even a valid one, but it's not making for good television. Gayle is clearly frustrated now, though she's maintaining her composure admirably. She points out that they're literally sitting in a television studio doing an interview, that the entire purpose of his being here is to discuss his work and connect with the audience. If he doesn't want to talk about his projects, why agree to come on the show? And there it is. The question that's been hanging in the air since this interview started going sideways. Billy Bob pauses again, that same heavy silence from earlier. When he finally speaks, his words are measured but cutting. He tells Gayle that he agreed to come on because his publicist said it would be good for the film, because there are obligations and expectations in this industry. But that doesn't mean he has to enjoy it or play along with the usual song and dance. Gayle's expression shifts from frustration to something closer to disbelief. She responds by saying that millions of people would love the opportunity to sit where he's sitting, to have a platform to share their work and their passion. Billy Bob lets out a short, humorless laugh. He tells her that's exactly the problem. This idea that he should be grateful for the opportunity, that he should perform like a trained seal because it's good publicity. He didn't get into music or acting to do publicity tours and morning show appearances. He did it because he had something to express, something to create. Gayle counters by pointing out that publicity is part of the job, that every artist, from musicians to actors to writers, has to promote their work if they want people to experience it. Billy Bob shakes his head slowly, telling her that there's a difference between sharing your work and reducing it to sound bites and anecdotes for mass consumption. Gayle's patience is visibly wearing thin now. She reminds him that he's an adult who made the choice to appear on the show, that nobody forced him to be here, and that if he finds the entire process so distasteful, perhaps he should reconsider accepting these invitations in the future. The tension is thick enough to cut with a knife. Billy Bob leans back in his chair, studying Gayle for a moment. Then he tells her that maybe she's right, maybe he should reconsider. Gayle, sensing an opportunity to either salvage the interview or at least end it on a less combative note, asks him what he would prefer instead. How would he like to talk about his work if not through traditional media appearances? Billy Bob's answer is surprisingly thoughtful. He says the work should speak for itself, that people should experience the film or listen to the music and form their own opinions without being told what to think or feel about it beforehand. He talks about how the constant need to explain and market everything strips away the mystery and magic of art. Gayle listens, and for a moment it seems like they might be finding some common ground. She acknowledges his point, saying that there's merit to letting art exist without commentary. But she pushes back by asking how people are supposed to discover new work in an oversaturated media landscape without some guidance or introduction. Billy Bob admits that he doesn't have all the answers, that maybe the whole system is broken and he's just one person frustrated by his small part in it. Gayle seizes on this moment of vulnerability, asking him what frustrates him most about the industry right now. It's a smart question, giving Billy Bob the chance to vent his frustrations in a more productive direction. But instead of taking the bait, Billy Bob turns it back on the media itself. He asks Gayle, when journalism became more about entertainment than information, when interviews became less about substance and more about getting viral moments and clickable quotes. Gayle visibly bristles at this. She defends her profession and her show, pointing out that they cover serious news and conduct substantive interviews regularly, that not every segment can be hard-hitting journalism, and that entertainment and culture are legitimate topics worth discussing. Billy Bob asks her if she really believes that, or if she's just repeating what she's supposed to say. That question crosses a line. Gayle's voice takes on a steely quality as she tells Billy Bob that she doesn't appreciate having her integrity questioned, that she's built a career on honest journalism and meaningful conversations, and that his cynicism doesn't give him the right to insult her or her work. Billy Bob responds that he's not insulting her personally. He's commenting on the state of the industry as a whole. Gayle fires back that he can't hide behind generalizations when he's sitting in her studio, on her show, directing his comments at her. If he has a problem with celebrity interviews and promotional appearances, he should take it up with the system, not take it out on her for doing her job. Billy Bob argues that she is part of the system, that everyone participating in it bears some responsibility for how it operates. The conversation has completely derailed from anything resembling a normal interview. Gayle's co-hosts look uncomfortable, occasionally glancing at each other but staying silent. Gayle tells Billy Bob that she's been nothing but professional and courteous to him since he sat down, that she prepared for this interview and tried to ask thoughtful questions, and that his hostility is uncalled for and honestly baffling. Billy Bob counters that her questions weren't as thoughtful as she thinks, that they were surface level and designed to elicit predictable responses rather than genuine conversation. Gayle asks him what would constitute a genuine conversation in his mind. Billy Bob says he'd know it if he was having one, and this isn't it. Gayle takes a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain her composure. She suggests that maybe the problem is Billy Bob's attitude rather than her questions, that he came in with a chip on his shoulder and was never going to engage honestly, no matter what she asked. Billy Bob denies this, saying he came in willing to have a real conversation, but the format and expectations made that impossible from the start. Gayle challenges this, asking him specifically, what about the format prevents real conversation? Billy Bob gestures around vaguely, talking about the time constraints, the commercial breaks, the need to keep things light and palatable for morning audiences, the fact that everything is being recorded and will be clipped and shared out of context. Gayle points out that he knew all of this when he agreed to appear, that these conditions aren't a surprise. Billy Bob admits that she's right, but says that knowing something intellectually and experiencing it in the moment are different things. Gayle asks if he's saying he's uncomfortable, and Billy Bob says that's too simple a word for what he's feeling. Gayle, softening slightly, asks him to explain what he is feeling then. Billy Bob pauses, seeming to genuinely consider the question. He talks about feeling like a product being marketed rather than a person having a conversation, about the disconnect between who he is and who he's expected to be in these situations, about the exhaustion of maintaining a public persona. It's the most honest and vulnerable he's been during the entire interview. And Gayle responds with empathy, acknowledging that the demands of fame and publicity can be draining. For a brief moment, it looks like they might actually turn this disaster into something meaningful. Gayle asks him how he copes with those feelings, and Billy Bob starts to answer, talking about his music and his private life. But then he stops himself mid-sentence and asks why he's expected to share this on television, why his coping mechanisms are considered appropriate content for public consumption. And just like that, the walls go back up. Gayle looks genuinely exhausted now. She tells Billy Bob that he's the one who started sharing, that she didn't force him to discuss his feelings, and that he seems to be fighting against himself as much as he's fighting against the interview. Billy Bob doesn't disagree, but he doesn't elaborate either. The silence stretches out again, even more uncomfortable than before. Gayle makes one more attempt to steer things in a productive direction. She asks Billy Bob if there's anything he does want to talk about, anything at all, giving him complete control over where the conversation goes. Billy Bob considers this, then asks Gayle why she does what she does, why she chose journalism, and what keeps her coming back to this chair every morning. It's an unexpected reversal, and Gayle seems genuinely surprised by the question. She starts to answer, talking about her love for storytelling and connecting with people. But Billy Bob interrupts her, asking if she's giving him a genuine answer or the media-trained response. Gayle stops, looking directly at Billy Bob, and tells him it's both, that her genuine feelings and her professional identity are intertwined after all these years. Billy Bob nods slowly, seeming to accept that answer. He tells her that maybe that's the difference between them, that he's never been able to reconcile those two parts of himself, the private person and the public figure. Gayle suggests that maybe he doesn't have to reconcile them, that they can exist as separate things. Billy Bob laughs again, but this time there's less bitterness in it. He tells her that's easy to say but harder to live. Gayle agrees, admitting that maintaining boundaries between public and private life is challenging for anyone in the spotlight. She asks Billy Bob if he's ever considered stepping away entirely, just focusing on his music and art without the Hollywood machine. Billy Bob says he's thought about it constantly, but that there's always another project, another opportunity, another obligation pulling him back in. Gayle asks why he lets himself be pulled back in if it makes him this miserable. Billy Bob bristles at the word miserable, saying that's not what he said and not how he'd describe his life. Gayle apologizes and rephrases, asking why he continues to participate in a system that clearly frustrates him so deeply. Billy Bob tells her it's complicated, that there are aspects of his work he loves and aspects he hates, and that you can't always separate them. Gayle presses further, asking him to talk about what he does love about his work. Billy Bob seems reluctant to answer, as if admitting to enjoying any part of this world would somehow undermine his earlier criticisms. But eventually he talks about the actual craft of acting, the moments on set when everything clicks and the character comes alive, the collaboration with directors and fellow actors who push him to dig deeper. Gayle listens intently, and points out that what he's describing sounds passionate and fulfilling, that it contradicts the cynical persona he's been projecting throughout the interview. Billy Bob argues that both things can be true, that he can love the work and hate the circus surrounding it. Gayle asks if he can have one without the other, and Billy Bob admits he doesn't know, that maybe they're inseparable in the modern entertainment landscape. The conversation has shifted into something more philosophical now, less combative but still charged with tension. Gayle brings up other actors who've managed to maintain relatively private lives despite their success, asking Billy Bob if he's considered adopting similar strategies. Billy Bob says everyone's situation is different, that what works for someone else might not work for him. Gayle challenges him on this, suggesting that maybe he's not trying hard enough to set boundaries, that he's participating in the very system he claims to despise and then complaining about it. Billy Bob's expression hardens again. He tells Gayle that she's oversimplifying a complex issue, that it's easy to judge from the outside but harder to navigate when you're living it. Gayle responds that she's not on the outside, that she deals with many of the same pressures and expectations in her own career, that she understands the challenges of public life. Billy Bob scoffs at this, saying their situations aren't comparable. Gayle asks why not, what makes his experience so unique. Billy Bob struggles to articulate an answer, talking in circles about artistic integrity and authenticity without really explaining how his situation differs from hers. Gayle, sensing his frustration, tries a different approach. She asks Billy Bob what would have made this interview better in his eyes, what she could have done differently. Billy Bob is quiet for a long moment, then admits he doesn't know, that maybe nothing could have made it better because the fundamental problem isn't with her or her questions but with his own discomfort with the entire premise. It's a surprisingly self-aware admission, and Gayle acknowledges this. She tells him that she appreciates his honesty, even if the interview has been difficult. Billy Bob asks if she's being sincere or just trying to end things on a positive note. Gayle tells him she's being sincere, that difficult conversations can be valuable even when they're uncomfortable. Billy Bob seems to consider this, then asks Gayle if she thinks people will take away anything meaningful from watching this. Gayle says she can't control how people interpret it, that some will think he was being difficult and others will appreciate his willingness to push back against standard interview conventions. Billy Bob asks which camp she falls into. Gayle pauses, then tells him honestly that she thinks he was being unnecessarily difficult, but that she also understands where he's coming from, that both things can be true. Billy Bob nods, seeming to accept this assessment. He tells Gayle that he appreciates her sticking with the conversation, even when it got uncomfortable. Gayle says that's not how she operates, that she believes in letting conversations play out organically even when they go off script. Billy Bob asks if they're off script right now, and Gayle admits they went off script about 10 minutes ago. Billy Bob smiles slightly, the first genuine smile he's shown during the entire interview. He tells her that maybe this is what he was looking for all along, a moment of real interaction rather than rehearsed pleasantries. Gayle points out the irony that he had to make everyone uncomfortable to get to this point. Billy Bob acknowledges this, saying he doesn't know how to get there any other way. The energy in the studio has shifted dramatically from where it was at the start, less hostile but also more tired, as if both of them have exhausted themselves getting to this point. Gayle glances at the clock, aware that they've already run over their allotted time. She asks Billy Bob if he wants to mention his film or his music before they wrap up. Billy Bob waves his hand dismissively, saying that people who are interested will find it, that he's not going to do a hard sell at the end of this conversation. Gayle smiles despite herself, telling him that he's impossible. Billy Bob asks if that's a compliment or a criticism. Gayle says it's an observation. Billy Bob accepts this. Gayle thanks him for coming on the show, and there's a sincerity in her voice that wasn't there during the standard opening pleasantries. Billy Bob thanks her for not giving up on the conversation. Gayle tells the audience they'll be right back after a commercial break, and the cameras cut away. But instead of staying in his seat for the break, like guests normally do, Billy Bob stands up immediately. He removes his microphone without waiting for the audio tech to come help him. Gayle watches this, saying his name with a questioning tone. Billy Bob looks at her and tells her he thinks he's done, that he's said everything he came here to say, and probably more than he should have. Gayle asks if he's seriously walking off right now. Billy Bob says the interview is over. He's just not sticking around for additional segments. Gayle points out that they had planned for him to stay through the next segment, that walking off now is going to create headlines. Billy Bob tells her there would be headlines regardless after the interview they just had. Gayle can't really argue with that. She asks him if he regrets any of it. Billy Bob considers the question seriously, then tells her he regrets that it got as tense as it did, but that he doesn't regret being honest about his feelings. Gayle asks if honesty has to be confrontational. Billy Bob says, not always, but sometimes, especially when you're fighting against ingrained expectations. The producers are trying to get Gayle's attention, signaling that they're about to come back from commercial. But Gayle is still focused on Billy Bob, who is clearly preparing to leave. She tells him she hopes he finds whatever it is he's looking for. Billy Bob pauses, looking at Gayle with something that might be respect. He tells her he hopes she stays passionate about her work. Gayle thanks him for that. Billy Bob gives a small nod and turns toward the exit. As he walks away from the set, the crew members are scrambling, unsure if they should stop him or let him go. Gayle remains in her seat, professional to the core, her preparing to come back from commercial and address what just happened. But there's no hiding the fact that this interview has become something nobody expected. A raw and uncomfortable look at the tension between celebrity and authenticity. The cameras come back on, and Gayle has to explain to the audience that Billy Bob has left the building. That the interview took an unexpected turn. Her co-hosts chime in with their reactions, trying to process what they all just witnessed. In the control room, producers are already making decisions about how to handle this. Social media is about to explode with opinions. But in this moment, as Gayle transitions to the next segment with the professionalism that's made her career, the lasting image is of Billy Bob Thornton, walking away from a conversation that got too real for the comfortable confines of morning television. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below with your answer to this question. Do you think celebrities have an obligation to play the publicity game, or should they be allowed to promote their work on their own terms?